The Seelow Heights area was crucial in Germany's last effort to repel its enemies. If the defensive line was pierced, the gates of Berlin would be open for the Soviet army to seize the heart of the crumbling Third Reich. As such, more than 1 million Red Army soldiers were repeatedly pushed back by a relentless German force that was under-equipped, underfed, and most importantly, outnumbered 10-1. The heart and soul of this genius defense was General Hasso Baron von Manteuffel, a seasoned World War I veteran, whose leadership proved decisive in defying the waves of Soviets sent to strike down the Germans. Under intense artillery barrages, tank columns of over 50 T-34 tanks, and the diminishing morale of his troops, Manteuffel was prepared to give his life for the Reich, until support came to relieve his men, if it ever came. Years of setbacks. In early 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling and on its knees, but it kept fighting vigorously with all the manpower it could muster. From teenagers to elderly folk, every German that could carry a gun was called to the front lines to stop the Allied forces, especially the Soviets, from pouring into what remained of Germany. Long gone were the days when the Wehrmacht reigned supreme over Europe. It was now being choked by the Anglo-American forces advancing from the west and the Red Army hordes attacking from the east, which was now at Germany's natural pre-war boundaries. In January of 1945, the Red Army pierced into East Prussia to capture Königsberg. General Heinz Guderian had requested the Führer to withdraw about 300,000 men from the Kurland region, but he refused and condemned the troops to a Soviet encirclement. The group was renamed Army Group Kurland. Other army groups fighting in Poland and East Prussia were also renamed according to the location where they would fight to the last man. Army Group Center in East Prussia became Army Group North, and Army Group A in Silesia took over the name Army Group Center. The Führer also created Army Group Vistula to defend the Baltic Corridor and Pomerania from being cut off from the rest of the German forces engaging the Soviets. On April 9th, Königsberg, the jewel of the East, surrendered to the Soviets after unstoppable artillery bombardments that destroyed 80% of the city. The Red Army then advanced into the heart of Germany, but not without a high cost. The German resistance had cost them 2 tank and 6 infantry divisions. However, the casualties had paid off, and Berlin was one step closer to falling under the fists of Stalin. The gates of Berlin. For a moment, the Soviet advance stopped to give their supply lines enough time to catch up for a renewed offensive. Meanwhile, the retreating Germans took a deep breath and reinforced their lines to defend the outskirts of Berlin. General Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front was over 1 million men strong. Moreover, the Marshal had more than 3,060 tanks and 17,000 artillery pieces and mortars to destroy any obstacles that could impede his forces from marching into Berlin. On the other hand, the German defenders amounted to a little over 110,000 men, meaning that they were outnumbered 10-1, while also being under-equipped and undertrained. These forces comprised the 3rd Panzer Army under General Hasso Baron von Manteuffel and the German 9th Army led by General Theodor Busse. Over 2,550 guns and some 600 panzers were all they had at their disposal. Manteuffel's forces were stretched thin, from Stettin to the Hohenzollern Canal and the Oder River. His defensive positions were the last line of defense between the Soviets and Berlin. The Seelow Heights, also known as the Gates of Berlin, were a series of plains and plateaus about 35 miles away from the capital, and were the only natural obstacle between the thousands of Red Army soldiers and the heart of the Third Reich. Here, Manteuffel and his men grew strong, fortifying the area with trenches, machine gun nests, artillery emplacements, and other defenses. On April 8th, Marshal Ivan Konev ordered the Soviet 6th Army to attack the Germans, then rolled into the front lines in a wide front that would converge on the Germans' left flank to deal one definitive blow. However, despite their sheer superiority in men and equipment, the 6th Army was pushed back by the defenders. From Panzerfausts, minefields, and tank destroyers, the men under Manteuffel were ready to fight to the last man, and proved so with lethal effects. Last line of defense. During the initial assault, Konev's Sixth Army suffered more than 2,300 casualties, 3,500 wounded, 80 tanks lost, and more than 12 fighter bombers. The Germans lost over 300 men, 2 Tiger tanks, and over 7 aircraft. The Red Army launched another full-fledged assault the following day on April 9th. Once again, the more than 50 T-34 tanks of the first wave were utterly destroyed by German Stukas, rockets, and Panzerfausts. Konev's second wave followed the same path as the first attack, hoping that most of the mines had already been detonated, but they ultimately suffered the same fate. Manteuffel and Buss's fight would not last forever. Every tank, aircraft, and gun lost was irreplaceable, and the Soviets had 9 other men to replace every other lost one in combat. Still, the German soldiers, Luftwaffe fighters, and a few artillery pieces were able to destroy over 150 tanks by April 10th. Over 12 of them were taken down by 130 Waffen-SS troops led by Major Rudolf Falkenhahn. Meanwhile, Major Hannes Gottlieb was close to the SS troops, with a unit that manned PAK-40 anti-tank guns. Like the rest of the troops, they were low on ammunition, food, and other supplies, but they kept fighting wave after wave of enemies. On April 11th, the fight turned costlier for both armies. Fortunately for Manteuffel, the remnants of the 5th SS Division Viking, the 28th SS Division Wallonian, the 23rd SS Division Nederland, and the 11th SS Panzergrenadier Division Nordland showed up to join the fray. The combined forces were less than a division strong, but they had captured several enemy tanks and guns that were very much needed by the defenders. Konev kept sending tanks and infantry, but each was driven back with enormous casualties, and Teutonic resistance stiffened as each day passed. Nevertheless, the Germans had to give up terrain with every artillery barrage the Soviets ordered to preserve the lives of their men. Shattering artillery barrages. The setbacks Konev encountered soon reached Joseph Stalin, who wanted the city captured by May 1st. Konev assured him that German resistance would crumble in the next few days, and amassed all his reserves for another full-scale assault. Manteuffel knew something was cooking behind the Soviet lines and pulled back to more defensible positions. Meanwhile, SS Gruppenführer Felix Steiner, a seasoned warrior, amassed every able-bodied SS soldier from the surviving Waffen-SS divisions and joined Manteuffel to defend the Seelow Heights. The days before April 16th were full of brutal hand-to-hand combat. Manteuffel was wounded when a Soviet unit stormed his command center and took the lives of most of his staff. Even so, he managed to make it out, but was taken back for recovery. Each commander was left to follow his inner warrior senses and continue the fight, and during the early hours of April 16th, Zhukov's entire Belarusian front went on the offensive with a massive artillery barrage. Thousands of Katyushas soon ravaged Seelow Heights. The Red Army attempted to use searchlights reflected off clouds to produce artificial moonlight and help the advancing Soviet units identify the enemy. However, the effect produced unexpected results and significantly favored the entrenched Germans, who tore apart the first Soviet units with pinpoint accuracy. All the same, the devastation caused by the more than 9,000 artillery pieces shook the entire area and forced the Germans to find cover. Soon after, the German commanders withdrew their vanguard units from the first line of defense to avoid unnecessary casualties from the bombardment. The highly motivated Red Army's 5th Shock Army then struck from the north, while the 8th Guards Army attacked from the south. They already saw themselves plundering the outskirts of Berlin and swiftly taking German prisoners by the thousands. In fact, their own propaganda had made them believe Berlin was right on the horizon, and that German resistance would crumble easily. But nothing was farther from the truth. Decimated by German audacity. 5 Soviet rifle divisions soon clashed with the German regiment of the 309th Infantry Division and the remains of 2 regiments of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Division in the northern region. The combat was fierce, as the 5 Red Army divisions were caught entirely off guard by the tenacity of the defenders and suffered heavy casualties. The German determination to fight to the last man was beyond what the Soviet infantry had been told. At the south of Seelow Heights, 7 Soviet divisions of the 8th Guards Army advanced toward the German lines with the support of artillery and tanks. The Heer's 303rd Infantry Division was overwhelmed from the very beginning, but it fought hard and it fought well against the superior odds. As the fighting intensified, remnants of the 20th Panzergrenadier Division showed up to help with anti-armor firepower to keep the Soviet vehicles at bay. Zhukov and his officers then realized the operation was not going as planned and sent all the reserves forward to further overwhelm the German forces. Crossing the Oder would not be easy, as the Soviet command had initially hoped. Besides the natural obstacles that the floodplain posed, such as mud and swampy terrain, accurate artillery fire from the few guns the Germans had at their disposal complicated the advance. The Carbon Canal at the base of Seelow Heights soon became an intense combat zone, in which Red Army casualties mounted by the thousands. Furthermore, the terrain was too steep and made it difficult for Red Army vehicles to make their way into the inner pockets of German resistance. As the Panzergrenadiers retreated, the Soviets had to scout the terrain and look for the best possible routes from which their armored vehicles and artillery pieces could be transported. These routes had to be defended at all costs. On to Berlin. Only one bridge at the Oder Canal was left untouched by the defenders. The rest were blown up to prevent the enemy from employing them to transport troops, and scattered German units were left to their fate if they could not cross in time. Meanwhile, Zhukov was under significant pressure from Stalin to continue the advance without interruption, and ordered his engineers to work under intense German fire to build river crossings. Stalin's demand to push forward into Berlin forced Marshal Zhukov to send the rest of his armored reserves into the fray before the infantry had time to catch up with them. Although the tanks managed to advance about 6 kilometers, dozens were destroyed by the defenders' artillery. On April 18th, the Seelow Heights were finally breached from the north, and the rest of the German forces, including the scattered Waffen-SS units, were ordered to retreat into Berlin to defend the city. A day later, the 1st Belarusian Front broke through the Seelow Heights and proceeded to finish off the trapped German units. The last defensive line between Berlin and the Soviets had finally been breached. Even so, the Soviets paid in blood for this offensive. Despite significantly outnumbering the Wehrmacht, they lost about 30,000 soldiers at Seelow, while another 600,000 would perish while taking Berlin. In contrast, the Germans lost over 12,000 men out of the 110,000 that took part in the defense, but most of the survivors would perish in the fight for Berlin. Thank you for watching our video. Please like and subscribe to our Dark Documentaries channels to find more exciting historical content. And don't forget to hit the bell icon to be notified of our newest videos. Stay tuned.